Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SAEM Resident and Medical Student webinar called Wellness Reframed, Innovative Initiatives to Improve the Well-Being of Residents and Medical Students. Thank you for all of those who are joining us via Zoom and Facebook and YouTube as well. My name is Dr. Jeff Sakamoto. I am the Secretary Treasurer of the SAEM RAMS Board, a member of the SAEM Wellness Committee, and one of the chief residents of the Stanford Emergency Medicine Residency Program. For those of you joining us for the first time, the core purpose of SAEM RAMS is to advance the future of emergency medicine through the development of resident and medical students into academic leaders. We do this through knowledge creation, translation, and dissemination. And we hope this particular webinar will bring you the information you need to know now. Tonight, we will be joined by academic emergency medicine wellness experts from all around the country who will speak with us about how we can tactically improve the wellness of residents and medical students. Resident and medical student wellness continues to be an important issue as we work to combat rising rates of burnout. Over the past few years, and despite the pandemic, progress has been made as creative, innovative initiatives have been implemented to improve well-being. I have the pleasure of welcoming three thought leaders who have greatly influenced advancements in resident and medical student wellness, Doctors Arlene Chung, L.A. Alvarez, and Steve Bird. Each will share a wellness initiative that they have helped pioneer that we can hopefully learn from and take back to our academic departments. And then most importantly, we will save plenty of time after our panel discussion to answer any lingering questions. During the presentation, you can submit questions for the presenters by clicking the chat button in your Zoom menu interface, and questions will be answered live during our questions and answer session immediately after our presenters have concluded. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists for tonight. First, Dr. Steve Bird is currently the Chief Experience Officer for Umass Memorial Healthcare and the University of Massachusetts Medical School. In that role, he is responsible for all physician engagement and wellness activities across the 5 hospital systems. He has been a faculty member of UMass since 2004, and prior to being the Chief Experience Officer, Dr. Bird was the Residency Program Director from 2011 to 2019. Dr. Bird also served as President of SCEM from 2018 to 2019. Dr. Arlene Chung is the Program Director for the Maimonides Medical Center Emergency Medicine Residency Program in Brooklyn, New York. She is also the immediate past chair of the ACEP Wellbeing Committee and serves on the New York ACEP Board of Directors. As a nationally recognized speaker and educator, Dr. Chung has made advocating for physician wellness a central focus of her career through lectures, teaching, policy development, and creating sustainable solutions for the future. Lastly, Dr. L.A. Alvarez is an assistant clinical professor in emergency medicine and an assistant program director in the Stanford Emergency Medicine Residency Program. Dr. Alvarez focuses on the interdependence of residency well-being with performance improvement on patient experience, quality and patient safety, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and medical education. Dr. Alvarez serves as the co-chair of the Stanford WellMD's Physician Wellness Forum and is one of the peer supporters for WellMD's Physician Resource Network support for faculty and trainees. To all of our speakers, thank you all for joining us tonight to share your expertise and insights. Dr. Bird, we will begin with your presentation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jeff, and welcome everyone to this session. So thank you for the introduction, and we're going to talk about wellness coaching for the next few minutes. Next slide. So by way of disclosure, I am a paid wellness coach by my institution, actually paid for by my office, but there is nothing else to disclose. So I want to set a background here. A few years ago, I was interviewing for chair positions and I didn't get them. And so my chair and my CEO said, Steve, I think you need a coach. And so they hired a professional coach for me. And the first thing she did was do an extensive 360-degree evaluation of me with these long interviews with more than 12 people. She spent a month doing that, putting together this long report. And then she presented me at our next meeting with that report. And the first 3 lines of that report were, Steve looks terrible. Steve looks like he's carrying the burdens of the department on his shoulders, and I'm worried about Steve. And for me, that was a tipping point. Obviously, I had been internalizing those feelings, but clearly I had been externalizing them as well, and everyone saw it. And for me, that was when I changed what I do in order to be well. Next slide. So when you all applied to medical school, this is probably the idealized physician that you thought of. This is Sir John Field's painting from 1891. Victorian era physician, sorry, he's an old white guy, in someone's home, attending to a sick child. If you look, that child's not even on a bed. That child is stretched across two chairs with a grieving parents in the background, a distraught mom with her head on the table. This was medicine, right? This is why you went to medical school. But this is not what you got when you went to medical school. What you got is the next slide. A confusing array of more than 200 entities, poorly communicating, promulgating statutes, requiring ever more documentation, and oh, by the way, also decreasing your reimbursement. This is what causes burnout to a large degree. Next slide. We've come a long way from Sir John Field's painting. You may have seen this in JAMA. I guess it's been 8 or 9 years ago. This was drawn by a 7-year-old girl. She's the patient on the exam table. In the background on screen right, you see her mom and an older sibling who's holding a younger sibling. And on the left side, furiously tapping away on the computer is the physician. This is what healthcare has largely become. The one, I guess, redeeming thing to this painting is everyone is smiling, even the doctor pecking away on his computer. Next slide. Burnout has really come into the lexicon of not only physicians, but the general public in the last few years. Many of you are familiar with this Medscape study looking at changes in burnout among specialties between 2013 and 2017. On the right are the specialties. The dark blue line in each specialty is burnout by specialty in 2013, and the light blue line is 2017. What you see here is that for every single specialty in the House of Medicine, burnout increased from 2013 to 2017, while overall burnout in US worker population did not change. So something has happened in medicine, undoubtedly. And emergency medicine has the ignominy of being on the top. Next slide. Interestingly, on day one of the first day of medical school, first year of medical school, medical students are the healthiest members of our entire population. When compared to age-matched controls, they have lower levels of burnout, lower depression, and overall highest quality of life of anyone in our society. They are the healthiest people in our society. However, on day one of the third year of medical school, next slide, medical students look just like residents with regard to burnout, depression, and overall quality of life. So what we do in medicine, we do early. In the first 2 years, we take the highest performing, healthiest, most well members of our society, and we make them look like residents. Next slide. So fortunately, SAM has been a member of the National Academy of Medicine Action Collaborative on Physician Wellbeing and Resilience. And this was the first conceptual model of burnout that group came up with. At the middle, there was a lot of debate. What goes at the middle of this conceptual model? Is it patient well-being or clinician well-being? It ended up being patient well-being. But the important thing here is there are 7 major domains, according to this conceptual model, of burnout, or domains of burnout, such as rules and regulations, organizational factors, personal factors, etc. But what's important here is, at least in this conceptual model, there are 7 different domains, but only 2 of them are related to an individual. However, much of what we do or try to address with regards to burnout and resilience and wellness is on those individual factors, personal factors, skills, and abilities. But that's only part of what leads to burnout. So we've unduly emphasized those two parts, sometimes at the expense of the other parts. Next slide, please. I'd like to change or reframe the issue here. So I try not to use the word burnout often when I'm at work, when I'm talking to people, because you can not be burned out, but not be well. So the goal is not to be burnt out, right? The goal should be to be well. So let's reframe it and talk about wellness rather than eliminating or mitigating burnout. Next slide. Fortunately, the limited studies done to date demonstrate that we can affect wellness or burnout. So this is from a meta-analysis in The Lancet 4 or 5 years ago. Remarkably, you could see at the top left, there were precisely 5 randomized controlled trials of wellness or burnout in physicians, with certainly more cohort studies. I think this now number stands at a whopping 7. But nevertheless, overall, these studies show, the meta-analysis, that interventions can improve wellness. And so what we're going to focus on in my part of the talk is wellness coaching. Next slide, please. So for those who are psychology majors, I was not. Positive psychology was really promulgated by Marty Seligman, I believe at UPenn. And wellness coaching is based upon those tenets of positive psychology. And what that really comes down to is focusing on strengths and building upon those strengths rather than focusing on weaknesses. And that is looking to build a positive, good life rather than trying to fix what has been bad or could be bad. Next slide. So there's a lot of different ways that one become a wellness coach. There are 5, 7, 10 online programs now. Well, they're now all online. They weren't before. What I'm going to talk about is the one that I've done and that we've done for our wellness coaches at Umass, which is wellcoaches.com. But they're all rooted in positive psychology. What a wellness coach does, so a lot of people have coaches, right? Michael Jordan, the best basketball player of all time, had a coach. Sorry, those LeBron fans. Tom Brady, the best football player of all time, has a coach. Wellness coaches don't tell people what to do, but rather they give them the tools to be self-efficacious. And what I mean by that is giving I'll call it a client here, the physician being coached, giving them the tools to allow them to make positive decisions and actions in their life, to change their life to what they envision. And I'm going to go through some real life examples here. So the coaches don't say what to do. Like, I think you should do this, right? A fitness coach may say you should do 100 burpees, right? A wellness coach doesn't say that, but they help the client figure out what they want and make changes to their life to realize that vision. Next slide. So the first part of the wellness coaching is what's called creating a wellness vision. This sounds a little hokey, but it is not, right? A wellness vision is, what is the idealized state that physician, that person wants, right? If you could have anything, like what would be your perfect life, right? That should be your wellness vision. And you have the client, and we spend an hour and a half creating these, remarkably. You have them write that wellness vision. Here are 3 examples from people I've coached. Some are physicians, some are not. So the first one, I am kind to myself and prioritize my own needs when appropriate. There is balance between my own internal happiness and my happiness connected to others. I am content and at inner peace. This next one was written by a senior resident. I'm excited to be a blank. I left that out for anonymity, and have a fulfilling career. I'm curious about the specialty and inspires others through clinical care, research, and teaching. I prioritize my family and don't sacrifice those relationships for my career. I lead an active life. For her, that was her idealized future. She said, if I could have this, that is perfect. That is what I want for my life. That's what the wellness vision is. And the next one I won't read to you. So the first part is creating a wellness vision, figuring out what it is that person wants. And you're not telling them as the coach, they figure it out for themselves. Next slide. Now, they've realized what they want to do. Now, how do you make changes, right? Because in those examples I just read to you, that's not the way those people were living, right? So how do they make those changes? Well, one of the tenets of positive psychology is that you leverage strengths, right? And strengths are simply things that you're good at. So if you want to change something, or you need to do something that's difficult, you wouldn't rely on something that's not your strength or a weakness, right? You would leverage what you're good at. And we do this, you can use this via character assessments, and there are lots of them. The one that I use with my clients is the VIA Character Strengths. There's a free online version. If you just Google VIA Character Strengths, you don't have to sign up for anything. A Gallup Strengths, many of you have probably done that. And there's actually a newer one called Wing Finder, which is a character strength that was derived and validated by Red Bull. So maybe you have more interest in doing that one. So we use these character or the strength assessments to identify what are those strengths that people have. And on the right side, you see there are 24 different strengths in the VIA Character Strengths. Next slide. All right, so you've created this wellness vision. Next thing that we do is we create 3-month goals. And the reason is, right, you need some kind of intermediate goal, something that gets you started towards the wellness vision. Interesting. That looks different. So they'll create 3-month goals. And what I like to say is success begets success, right? You have short-term goals, you're successful at intermediate goals, and then get you on your way to your wellness vision. So in this example, actually, can you go to the next slide, please? Previous slide. So on these goals, so they're intermediate. So these are from 3 different clients that I've done. So they have 3-month goals. So the first one was for a non-physician. He said, I'm going to have 1 new client relationship and reestablish 1 previous work relationship. He was in sales. He also said, I have no bad days. And I do weekly catch-ups with 2 people who are important in his life. So he's not saying that at the end of next week, he's going to have done all this, right? This is an intermediate goal. This is what he wants to do in the in the nearish future. All right. The second one, second client said, in the morning, I will spend 10 minutes journaling. I will create a daily food journal using some iPhone app. And I will spend 30 minutes twice a week engaged in some form of learning. So again, you can imagine if this person who wants to journal, right, if her goal was, I'm going to start journaling every single day, right, and you actually measure how often they do this, that's not a necessarily realistic goal, right? It may be the first goal could be like, I'm going to buy a journal, right, or I will journal every other day, right? Success begets success, right? Next step. Sorry about that. Next slide. I got a little caught up in my own slides. All right. So the last part in what you do every time you meet with a client, a wellness coach, is you create 1 to 2 week goals, right? So these are short term and they all need to be SMART, right? You're familiar with the SMART goals. They need to be specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time sensitive. So we have them make 3 goals over 1 to 2 weeks. They need to rate their confidence in reaching those goals on a 10-point scale, right? So if they say, I'm gonna journal every day for 15 minutes, and I think I'm a 3 out of 10 that I can do it, right? That's a wrong goal. The goal needs to be a 7 or higher to be doable. If they're saying, yeah, I can do 3 out of 10, that's my confidence, then that's the wrong goal, and the goal needs to be changed. So I won't read for you here, but you see the kind of goals that people made for their 1 or 2 week goals. For instance, the exercise. Instead of exercising every single day, I'll exercise 3 times per week. Okay, next slide. All right, so what is the evidence? I'm kind of an evidence and data person. What are the evidence that this works? You may have seen this, this RCT published in JAMA Internal Medicine in late 2019 from Mayo Clinic. Lottie Derby and Tate Shannonfeld, before he went to Stanford, was there. So they did an RCT of 88 docs. 48 were women and 50 men, allocated 1-to-1. And they received 3.5 hours of wellness coaching by a professional outside wellness coach over 5 months. And I will tell you, an outside coach costs $400 plus. It's usually more like $600 an hour. And then during this study, they did lots of assessments of their well-being and burnout and resilience and everything else. All right, let's look at the next slide. One of the assessments that they did, and you'll hear this a lot in the wellness literature, is the MBI, the Maslach Burnout Inventory. It is like the gold standard of burnout surveys. There's a few issues though. One, it was not designed or validated initially in physicians. And there are 3 sub areas within the within the MBI. That is emotional exhaustion. And for those who have been in medicine enough, you know exactly what that is, right? There's depersonalization. You also know what depersonalization is, right? You see the patient as a thing or a diagnosis or a means to an end or something that's impeding you going home. And then there's personal accomplishment, which is the 3rd area, which I feel in the data would support it, is not really as relevant for physicians. But emotional exhaustion and depersonalization certainly are. Next slide. So in this study, an RCT of 88 docs, they found that emotional exhaustion was statistically lower in the intervention group compared to the control group at 5 months, as were the overall burnout score and those who met criteria for high emotional exhaustion. So those are important. Next slide. They also found that overall quality of life of the physicians in the intervention improved, as did their resilience. You can see, however, that there are loads of other things that did not change, because wellness coaching is not a panacea, and wellness and burnout are complex things. So you can't expect one intervention to fix everything. Next slide. So what they found is that professional coaching can improve emotional exhaustion, overall quality of life, and build resilience, but it is not a substitute for organizational, institutional efforts to improve the practice environment, right? If you have a horrible EHR and people spend 3 hours a day charting their EHR after work, nothing you can do is going to make their life better. Next slide. So based on this, we have created our own wellness coaching program at Umass. We have 6 faculty who are certified by wellcoaches.com. We had 2 women and 6 men. I will tell you, over 80% of the people requesting the coaching are women. So I wish we had that ratio reversed. Getting certified is a 6 to 9 month process. And we give every client that is a physician, residents, they get 4 hours of free coaching over a 4-month period of time that's paid for by my office. And we are doing assessing their well-being at the beginning of the coaching, and then 6 months after the coaching ends. And then we're going to determine, we're doing our own RCT. Does the well coaching have a benefit? Next slide. All right, so you're thinking, this sounds really cool. How could we do this at our residency? So here are some of the challenges and solutions. So cost. So getting certified as a coach is about $2,200 a person, which isn't a lot. Actually, the expensive part is paying for the coach's time, right? Professional coach gets $600 an hour. And you can't do that. So what can you do? Well, if a faculty member or chief resident or fellow wants to become a well coach, they can use their practice allowance to get the training. GME or hospital could fund the training or could fund to pay the coach. Or another solution is actually the faculty who are well coaches use their academic protected time to actually do the coaching. So they're not getting paid for it, but they're getting that time, that academic time credit. Next slide. So another significant one is the privacy or learner supervisory concerns with residents and if the faculty were coaches. So what you could do is have residents be a coach. Residents could choose their coach. They chose a faculty member with whom they work, but the resident says, I want to work with this faculty member as a coach. As long as they understand that there's a learner supervisory relationship, then I think it's okay. You can also use, if you have a multi-site faculty like we do, you could use faculty from the non-academic sites to do the coaching. Or you could have faculty in other residency programs. So the faculty from general surgery be a coach for the emergency medicine residents. There's also a relatively new thing, these peer wellness coaches. So University of Colorado at Boulder and Boston College, where my son is, have peer wellness coaches now, which is another possibility. Next slide. So I'm sorry if I'm a little over, but strategies to mitigate burnout and improve wellness do work. And of all the studies, which are not a lot, wellness coaching actually shows the greatest benefit with regard to wellness. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Bird. Just to give some anecdotal experience, I went through the coaching process during my third year of residency and found it profoundly beneficial for my wellness and professional fulfillment. So thank you for talking about such an important topic. Next, we will hear from Dr. Arlene Chung.
This is why I love doing panels like this. Like, I also learned something about wellness coaching, which is a really amazing intervention. And so we learn from each other. Thanks so much for having me here. I appreciate that Dr. Bird laid the groundwork for this session as far as, the context of burnout and where we stand now with regards to emergency medicine in particular, and looking at, sort of our next generation of physicians coming up the pipeline. A specific intervention that I'm going to talk about this evening is storytelling, which is it's a slice within a slice within a slice, you could argue. But I think it's really powerful, right? I think telling stories is actually one of the most powerful one of the most powerful wellness interventions out there, because we all do it, right? So I'm sure some of us, in pursuing different ways to be more well, have looked at things like, yoga, but maybe we don't have the flexibility for it, or mindfulness, or maybe we don't have the attention span, or, different wellness interventions speak to different people. But I think the really wonderful thing about storytelling is that it speaks to everyone, right? We all tell stories. And I've always thought that there is something incredibly powerful about listening to a story, particularly if it's a story being told by someone who you've never met before, and instantly recognizing that story, because that story is the same as your own lived experience. And I think it really helps to mitigate or decrease some of that isolation that we often feel, that, I truly believe is at the crux of a lot of the burnout and some of the other things that we're seeing in medicine these days. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So this is, sort of how I got interested in storytelling to begin with. So once upon a time, I actually thought I was going to be a writer. This is this is an excerpt from my high school yearbook. So once upon a time, me and three of my best friends, we were in high school, and we thought, okay, let's just think about, like, what are we going to be doing in 10 years? And we're going to put that into our yearbook. And so this is what we came up with. And I said, okay, in 10 years, I'm going to be 26 years old, because I was 16 at the time. I was going to be still looking, and I was convinced that I was going to be a writer in a writing colony in a small forest hovel, right? And then I was going to live in the middle of nowhere, and I was going to write my books, and it was going to be amazing. I loved literature. I loved books. I loved writing. I loved creating stories. And so I went to university, and I was like, I'm going to do this. And it's like, I'm going to major in English. And so I took the introductory writing course my very first semester. And I poured like my blood and sweat and tears into it. In December, at the end of the semester, I thought to myself, that was like literally the hardest thing I've ever done. And so I'm going to do my backup plan, and I'm going to go into medicine, because I think that's easier. So I ended up going to medical school. And then, fast forward several years, and it's amazing how some of these interests, they never truly go away. And sort of at the end now, on the bookend of my training, which actually is sort of it's an interesting circle, right? So I'm a residency director now. I still maintain this interest in storytelling and how we can specifically use it through the lens of well-being and through the lens of education. So next slide, moving on. why are stories so powerful, right? Maybe that's the first question we should be asking. I would argue that storytelling is so powerful because fundamentally they help shape the culture of medicine. The way we talk to each other and the types of stories that we tell really inform something called the hidden curriculum. So the hidden curriculum was something that was probably best described by this guy, Frederick Hafferty, in this paper from Academic Medicine back in '98. And he talks about there are three different kinds of curricula that exist within medical education. So you have your formal curricula, which is everything that is taught in a classroom, their lectures, their textbooks, everything with a course syllabus. That's your formal curriculum. You have your informal curriculum, which consists of everything that you ever learned at the bedside. So these are all of the teaching pearls that any attending has ever showed you, bedside procedures, any sort of tips and tricks that you've learned from residents or from mentors at the bedside. This is all the informal curriculum. And then everything else is the hidden curriculum, right? Everything else that you've ever learned about what it means to be a doctor, but no one ever actually sat down and explicitly taught you. This consists of the hidden curriculum. And I think the way that we shape these things, the way that we shape our narratives, who are the heroes of the stories? Who are the villains of the stories? What kind of language do we use in describing our patients? What kind of language do we use in describing each other? I think that really informs how we view ourselves as physicians and how we view our roles within the context of both our jobs and our personal lives. The next slide, please. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a whole lot of robust research on this. So I love the fact that Dr. Bird presented, these really robust randomized controls, trials that demonstrate that interventions work. But unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot that exists within this particular a slice of wellness. And it is one of these, I feel like, there's a certain group of people, Tate Shanafeld has certainly been part of that have been really great at pushing forward the robust research. But we all need to do it, right? We all need to do it. And I think that's probably one of the calls to actions at the end of this panel about how do we actually move the needle on this. And I would argue that one of the ways is research. So I'm going to present here, some of the stuff that exists for efficacy for storytelling within graduate medical education. And I really was only able to find 2 studies that sort of got at the crux of what I'm trying to argue is actually a very powerful wellness intervention. So this study here, it was a narrative medicine workshop program that was implemented for OBGYN residents. And one of the specific outcomes they were looking at was burnout using the Maslach Burnout Inventory. And this is one of the few studies that actually tried to link narrative medicine and well-being. So there is a wealth of research out there associated with narrative medicine and reflective practice. So that body of literature does exist, but there's not as much that's linking that particular intervention with well-being or with burnout. And this is one of the few ones that exist. So they looked at 66 different OBGYN residents across 3 different institutions. And they had them participate in this narrative medicine workshop, which were 15 workshops spread over the course of 2 years that happened 1 to 2 months. And they did their assessment at the 1-year mark. So halfway through the full implementation of their curriculum. And what they found was, the highest, the people that went to the most sessions. So high utilizers were considered attending 4 or more sessions within that year. They did find a statistically significant decrease in emotional exhaustion in that subset of residents compared to the other residents. But again, it had, was sort of a subset analysis, and they did not actually find unfortunately, they didn't find any sort of larger robust studies, but they found it very encouraging that at least for the high utilizers, the people that really engaged with this program, they did find a benefit to this particular intervention. There was one other study, next slide, that was done in internal medicine residents that I found that was just looking at their interns. And again, it was a similar narrative medicine program where they engaged in these 1-hour sessions where they would do some reading and then reflective discussion and then some writing afterwards. And again, they did find a positive benefit of narrative medicine. And so in this particular study, the way that they assessed, it was a much smaller sample size. And so they didn't use the Maslach Burnout Inventory for this particular study, but they did a qualitative analysis of open-ended questions of a survey that the participants completed afterwards. And some of the predominant themes that they found were actually that it increased their mindfulness, it increased their sense of well-being, and it increased their sense of professionalism as well. so these are sort of in my literature searches. I was like, I was looking around and I was like, oh, this is kind of like what I'm trying to find evidence for, that, stories are great for well-being. And I'm like, well, this is kind of showing that narrative medicine is great for well-being. But what about stories? What about oral storytelling, right? Like getting together and swapping stories about all of our clinical experiences. What about that? Is there anything that exists out there in the literature? So this is what I found. So next slide, please. I found, this was actually an article that was written by a friend of mine, and he actually describes a very similar intervention to one that I'm going to go into detail a little bit later in this presentation. And he talks about just sort of anecdotally about their experience in implementing a storytelling program twice a year within their residency, and really sort of the robust positive response that they got from their residents. And he argues that it really, and for anyone who's been around, any of these storytelling events, really this sense of shared vulnerability does wonders, right? Does wonders to balm, as balm for the soul almost. And so he, was able to actually put this out there, which I really appreciated, because oftentimes this is the way that I have sort of felt about these events. But again, looking for studies, there was one that I found in Curious, next slide, that was looking at published stories. So again, this is more the storytelling, right? So less narrative medicine and more looking into actually sharing stories. And this was one published in Curious more recently that was looking at published written stories online, and to see, and what they actually saw was that asynchronously, so not in sort of a live format, but asynchronously, there was a lot of participation and a lot of engagement. But certainly this is an area for improvement. And it's one of those things that it's like, it when you see it, right? And it's like, for anyone who has felt really like someone knows them and someone speaks to them, listening to a story, we all do this, right? That's why podcasts like The Moth or StoryCorps, they're amazingly popular. It's because, we feel this sense of being included, of belonging when we hear stories that speak to us. But the question is, how do you capture it? And we'll argue again that is certainly an area for future development. So next slide, please. Maya Angelou, I love this quote: "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside yourself." And perhaps this is one of the ways, this is one of the reasons, and this is one of the mechanisms that we can use to decrease burnout, to let those stories go, right? And to bring those stories out into the light. So the next bit, the next part of the presentation, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about one of the programs that I helped to found a couple of years ago called Airway, True Stories from the Emergency Department. It's an interesting story, no pun intended, about how this came about. So as I mentioned earlier, I've had this sort of long love of stories, despite failing to pursue my original career as a writer. And I had graduated, it was my first or second year after graduating from residency. And I remember I was standing in the emergency department one day. It was a normal, it was a normal like Thursday afternoon or something. And we had a little bit of a lull in our patient care. And I remember standing there with a friend of mine, Joshua Schiller. And two of us were just talking, and he's sort of a like-minded person. And we were saying, wouldn't it be just amazing if there was something out there, again, like The Moth or like StoryCorps, that was it was a way for emergency physicians to really like tell all of these stories, all these amazing stories, and to share all these amazing experiences and feelings and vulnerabilities and laughter and triumphs and sadness and all of this stuff that we experience every single day, right? What other job do you actually engage with death and dying and bringing people back to life and all of the amazing things that encompass emergency medicine? Who goes to work and that and you do that, actually do that. And so so we were like, okay, let's just do it. And so what we did back in 2015, we created a series of storytelling events, initially based locally in New York City, and we called it Airway. We went through a couple different names, right? So we were like, we're going to call it like the Central Line, or like, Airway was what we finally ended up on, because the idea was like, okay, you're, Airway, and you're telling stories. And initially everyone was like, oh, I really want to come, but I don't have any Airway stories. It's like, no, they're not just stories about airways. They're, all stories about being an emergency physician. And it was amazing. We didn't know what to expect the first time around. But the response was much more robust than we could have imagined. And, over the course of a couple years, we got many people would come to these events. We'd actually pack the room once upon a time before, I look at these photos and I'm like, oh, I miss getting together with people. But we had all comers, right? So we had medical students, we had residents, we had attending physicians who've been practicing for 20 plus years. We had, NPs, PAs, physicians, we had paramedics, we had dental students, we had pathologists, we had some Navy folks from Yale showed up in New York, and it was amazing. And the breadth of stories was quite phenomenal too. And I think it gets at this idea of shared vulnerability, and this idea that, we're social creatures, right? And one of the most powerful ways that we, bond together and that we support each other is by telling stories. And so if you want to do this at your own shop, how do you do this, right? What does this look like? Does it require lots of money? Do I need tons of resources? Do I need an expert to come in and run the event? Do I need an event planner? It's like, no, you don't need any of these things. And I would argue that you can actually, it's the nice thing about running storytelling events is that they're very scalable, right? They're very scalable depending on what your needs are. And so certainly you could do something small and intimate within, say, a residency program, or you could do something much larger, right? At a national conference, or, at a large scale citywide event. So they're very scalable. They don't actually necessarily need to stay within emergency medicine either. And so step one, along those lines is really, what's your goal? What's your, who's your target audience? What are you looking for? Again, are you looking at learners? Are you looking at medical students? Are you looking at the GME world? Are you looking at residents? Are you looking at practicing physicians? Are you looking outside of sort of the physician space? Do you want to include people who also work within healthcare, frontline healthcare providers, nurses, pharmacists, physician assistants, advanced practice providers, pre-hospital providers? And do you want to go sort of within your own institution, within your own department? Or are you looking multi-institutional or sort of citywide, right? Are you including lay persons, right, non-healthcare providers as well? Generally speaking, we have found the most success actually keeping it within the healthcare space. And I think it's because people tell stories a little bit differently to each other than to other people who aren't within healthcare. And I think the main goal of these is really you find solidarity with each other, right, and shared experiences. And so we found that the most powerful events have actually just been keeping it within the healthcare space. So you figure out your audience. You determine your size. I will tell you, the smaller the group, and the more they know each other. So you could argue like, a class of interns, for example, versus something like New York City. You get a very different feel, a very different vibe. Not necessarily better or worse, just different, right? And it depends on what your goals are. I will tell you that the smaller the event, the more sort of there will be much more interaction. There'll be a lot more discussion. There'll be a lot more sort of probing and going into deep diving into the stories. Whereas the larger events tend to be a lot more performative, right? So entertainment value, performative, but they also, in many ways, they accomplish the same goal. So something to think about across those lines. It can be a wonderful thing, really, for fostering interprofessional collaboration as well, and building those bridges, with people who are really in the trenches with us, right? So it's not just us, but there's a whole bunch of people out there who are also going through the same thing. So once you've nailed that down, right, once you figure out who your audience is and what your ultimate goal is, step two comes down to some of the logistics and the planning. So you set a budget, right? Do you have any money? Do you have a budget? If you don't have a budget, that's cool. Like, you do not actually need any external funding, which is probably one of the best things about this intervention. You just need people who are willing to get together and talk to one another. So again, sort of in this Zoom era, whether it's, venue wise, whether you're actually going to a physical location or whether you're doing it on Zoom, right? So figuring out what your venue is, what your budget is. I will tell you that in our experience, so in New York City, resident sort of didactic days are on Wednesday. So all of the residency programs in the New York City area, it's always on Wednesday. So Tuesday nights tend to be a very, universally tends to be a very flexible night for residents to attend these types of events. And so we always traditionally held our New York City events on Tuesday nights. And I will tell you that local, restaurants and sort of venue spaces. Tuesdays are a very slow night. And so if you go to them and say, hey, I don't have any money, but we really want to use this space on a very slow night for you. And we promise we will bring in lots of business that you would otherwise not get with a very, very scant budget. I trust me, you can actually get a reasonably nice space. So thinking about venue, obviously you pick a date. If you can get some sponsors, so sometimes different institutions are actually willing to sponsor these types of events. And then advertising as well. So with the era of social media, obviously advertising has become much easier. And then extras, right? So extras are like nice perks that you don't necessarily need to have, but they're nice to have, right? Food is a wonderful thing to consider. Again, if you have a little bit of, if you have some institutional help there, you can always buy for some food. Everyone loves free food. And then finally, logistics. So once you get sort of all that planning done, like what are the logistics of the actual event? And the question often comes up, like storyteller recruitment, right? Who is going to tell these stories? And I think there's a range. And what we have found is with our experience with these airway events is that, you have a spectrum, right? So on the one hand, you can have 100% sort of open mic event where you show up and you have no idea what's going to happen. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you can have like a completely curated list where you know exactly which storytellers are going to go in what order and what exactly their stories are going to be. And so within that spectrum, there is a range. And I will tell you that again, sort of depending on the size and the audience, like the smaller and the more intimate the group, the more flexibility you have to show up and not have anything sort of pre-planned, right? But the larger and larger the event, in order to ensure success, I would highly recommend, the larger the event, the more that you want to curate it. I do think that there is power in leaving some flexibility for these. It's a little scary as an event planner if you're a type A person, not that any of us are type A people who go into medicine. It can be a little scary to just sort of like leave it open-ended, like, gosh, who knows who's going to come up and what are they going to say and all of those things. But we found that there's a lot in many, many, many of our events. So the events that we've held in New York City, which are probably some of our largest events, I think probably the highest numbers have been about 60, 70, 80, 100 people showing up to these events. We have left a proportion of the stories open, right? Open mic style. And it is amazing how many people will be moved where they show up to these events and like, I'm not saying anything. Like, I'm here to hang out and to listen to listen to other people tell stories. And then they listen to these stories and it triggers their own memories. And it is amazing the people that sort of get overwhelmed and really get sort of infused with this confidence to come up, and they tell stories that they never in a million years thought that they would tell people. But we've had all sorts of people come up who just they're like, I'm not a public speaker, I'm not a storyteller, I've never told this before, but since we're all here anyway, I just feel like I need to get this off my chest to share. And so I think there is some value in leaving it open-ended. You can offer pre-event coaching, right? So for those people who, they have a story, because we all have a story, right? Whenever someone asks us, oh, tell me a story. What's the craziest case you ever heard? We all have like a story, offering pre-event coaching. And there's a whole realm of like, how do you tell stories and what the story structure is and how do you engage an audience? And all of that does exist out there. Obviously, you want to set some ground rules, right? So language-wise, HIPAA, no sharing of social security numbers, medical record numbers, none of that, and preserving anonymity when possible. The timing is sort of interesting. We found that the optimal length of time for these events is somewhere between an hour and 90 minutes. It is very difficult to continue to engage an audience much beyond that. I think that's why movies once upon a time were 90 minutes long, but something to consider that in order to ensure the success of an event, you really want people to be perhaps not quite satisfied. Always leave them wanting a little bit more. So probably better to err on that side than to have them trickle out towards the back. And then lastly, data gathering. And this kind of goes to what I was alluding to earlier, where collecting some information, did the participants like it, focus groups, other kinds of ideas afterwards for figuring out like, how do you quantify something that is inherently so qualitative, right? That is the crux of the question. And I think at its heart, that's probably the difficulty with a lot of these wellness interventions. It's like, how do you qualify something? How do you measure something that is so abstract for so many people? And I think we're figuring it out. I do think as a group, as a wellness group, we are figuring out how to do there, and that work is coming slowly. But storytelling, I have found that universally, people come to these events, people share stories, and they just feel so moved. And it's like, how do you capture that feeling? What does that look like? And we're still in the process of figuring that out ourselves. If you're interested in learning more, we have a website. You're welcome to check us out online or on Twitter. And yeah, I hope this has inspired some of you to go out there and tell your own stories.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chung. Definitely inspiring. Just as a reminder, feel free to enter any questions in the chat. And lastly, we have Dr. L.A. Alvarez talking. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Really grateful for this opportunity and honored to follow Dr. Arlene Chung and Dr. Steve Bird. Again, my name is L.A. Alvarez. I'm one of the APDs at Stanford. I'm also the co-chair at the Stanford WellMD's Physician Wellness Forum. Tonight, I'd like to share a resident-driven intervention in our residency during initial months of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's using what Dr. Chung just said, shared about storytelling, and doing it as a reflection rounds, or instead of rounding on your patients, really the goal is to round on the care team and checking in. Next slide. I wanted to acknowledge the following names who led and developed this program with me. Next slide. Dr. Bird walked us through the complexity of the medicine as we know it and how it leads to burnout. Saying it's been a tough 12 months would be an understatement. Our resilience and our resolve have been tested forwards, backwards, and all sorts of ways. The rapid changing protocols that we had to adapt to, social distancing, isolation, the murder of George Floyd, California wildfires, vaccinations, and structural racism, January 6th. I can go on and on about this. The snowstorms across the country right now, Texas, add a few earthquakes here in the Bay Area, and to top it off, showing up to work as frontline workers and putting ourselves at risk for the virus. And when not on shift, the Zoom meetings after Zoom meetings. And so sometimes even 2 or 3 of these Zoom meetings all at once, right? And so for the parents in the audience, especially the moms, I just want to commend you and take this time as well to just realize that for the sacrifices of balancing life and work and more Zoom meetings like this one. So almost a year into this pandemic, it's clear that, next slide, that we have come a long way. The Stanford Emergency Medicine Reflection Rounds was designed to humanize the experience of frontline trainees, our residents, to reflect and use meaning-making and narrative medicine to, again, normalize the challenges, the celebrations, and to simply just manage the pandemic stressors that we were all dealing with. We didn't have names for these before, back when we started the reflection rounds. And so we wanted to design a system that facilitates connectedness and belonging during a pandemic where social isolation was key to really moving forward. Next slide. Because the grass is always greenest where you water it. And we believe that we have to also start taking care of ourselves. Next slide. And so again, I think back to the slides that Dr. Bird showed to depict medical school training. Residency training has its own innate challenges that lead to feelings of isolation in medicine. The COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated this sense of isolation. Fatigue, stress, anxiety, and frustrations all add to the spectrum of human emotions that resident trainees experience. So navigating this balance between professional and personal responsibilities in the middle of a pandemic creates this unique need for connection, especially during, again, physical distancing and shelter-in-place restrictions. And so the ability to reflect on one's inner life is critical to practicing medicine with integrity, authenticity, and coherence. And that was our goal. Next slide. It started with an email. Dr. Moulton, who was our chief resident then, recognized the importance of managing this emotional toll that the pandemic is already beginning to impact our residents. So earlier that year, I co-led a reflection rounds for the medical students. So these are required in-person quarterly sessions in our medical school during their clerkship years. And so I reached out to the chaplain to see if we can convert this into a volunteer-only virtual event. Next slide. The conversation gained some momentum, and 4 days later, the first Stanford Emergency Medicine COVID reflection rounds came about. Next slide. And so those who participated found the session really meaningful. And so let's break down what these series of events entailed. Next slide. So one key element of reflection rounds is creating that space to promote psychological safety. Dr. Chung alluded to this as well. We believe that in order for this to be truly safe, faculty was not to participate. So initially, I was actually part of this. And then as we were listening to the conversations, we were realizing that, it probably will be helpful if faculty was not there, especially since we are the ones that's also evaluating them for their performance in the emergency department. And so we were fortunate to have a former emergency medicine physician who's now a chaplain to lead this session. As an emergency physician, Dr. Feldstein can empathize to the experiences that the residents would be sharing. And so the role of the chaplain in this case is to facilitate discussions without it devolving into a tornado of negativity. You can see this happening sometimes, right? Like you share a story and then another person kind of piles onto it and it becomes negative if you don't really have the ability to reframe that quickly or change the direction of the conversation. And that can be very contagious and dangerous as well. Next slide. And so we came into developing this program with the understanding that residents would share many of the struggles that they were experiencing clinically and at home. Next slide. And so again, as Dr. Chung just highlighted, the value of vulnerability, the success of reflection rounds really truly hinges on how vulnerable the participants allow themselves. And this is why we believed in creating that psychologically safe space. Next slide. So throughout the 90-minute session, and similarly, so 60 to 90 minute was really the time frame that we were looking for. The chaplain asked for 2 hours, and we tried 2 hours initially. And I think because we're emergency physicians, we were really aiming for the shorter version of it. But we emphasized the goal of reflection rounds, which was for listening and not offering any advice or fixing. And so any personal experiences were fair game. Next slide. So as one resident shared their story, it was as if they were peeling an onion layer by layer and realized the common humanity in their experiences. Next slide. There were stories of struggles. There were stories of amazing saves, of humanizing experiences. And here's a quote from one of the residents. Clearing the clutter and creating a clear headspace allows us to have the resiliency to withstand the emotional challenges imposed by this pandemic. This in turn allows us to provide optimal care for our patients. Here's one of the reflections, and the resident gave consent to share this with you to highlight the impact of reflection rounds. It was an experience of this resident suturing a forehead laceration on a patient that fell. The patient thanked the resident for caring for her. The laceration was not really eventful. There's nothing to write home about. And so the resident moved on to the next patient. At the reflection rounds, this resident shared how at that time they were preoccupied with their seemingly never-ending to-do list. They reflected on how in retrospect, they missed what should have been a beautiful moment of gratitude and the guilt that they experienced having overlooked this opportunity to connect with their patient. This, of course, is an example of moral distress. And so each one of us, I'm sure, have had this situation or have been in this situation. And so the resident then shared that after sharing this reflection, they felt validated after seeing the nods of agreement from the audience. And the audience here really is a smaller group, and this one is virtually done, so via Zoom. The resident shared that reflecting on this experience allowed them to be more mindful of being present for these small moments of gratitude, these micro moments that are a part of what create meaning in our work. Next slide. Often when we work so fast during busy shifts and we forget to relish on these moments. It's important to acknowledge the ups and downs of our experiences on shift. We don't always get it right. And we won't always get the best outcome. Yet we try, and in our efforts to be better, we develop and improve our craft. Next slide. And so reflection rounds really is an opportunity to remind each of us that none of us are alone, that we share a common thread of successes and challenges. Next slide. And that it's okay to feel overwhelmed and to struggle a little bit. It's okay to struggle some. It's okay to struggle a lot. And it's okay to not be okay. Next slide. Reflection rounds or reflection with peers allow us to decompress and deconstruct the difficult decisions and normalize the complex series of emotions that we face every day. So while not for everyone, reflection rounds can be an effective method for us to become more aware of our own emotions. Reflection rounds here offer an opportunity for emergency physicians like you to be vulnerable about our inner life experiences as frontline healthcare workers, our personal reactions, our values, beliefs, meaning, purpose, and connectedness. Next slide. So during this pandemic, it's clear we're figuring this out day by day. We can learn from each other rather than going through this alone. And so it's important to, hopefully one of the take homes from this is that you can reach out to each other, share your stories, get a coach. And so thanks again. Most of the images in the slides are from Liz and Molly. Check out her book, their book. I highly recommend it. It's actually in my list of books to do a book club with the residents. And again, thank you for this opportunity to present our work. Next slide.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Alvarez, and thank you again to all of our panelists for your incredible insight and informative presentations. We will begin a quick question and answer now. And again, if anyone has questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat. So the first question I have, a few years ago, I feel like a lot of the interventions for wellness included things like eating healthy or exercising or mindfulness exercises. However, over my time from medical school into residency, it seems that more data-driven targeted interventions have been introduced to improve wellness, such as the ones mentioned in this talk. Dr. Bird and Dr. Chung and Dr. Alvarez, feel free to chime in as well. It seems that wellness coaching is one of the new things on the horizon to improve wellness. Where do you think the direction of resident and medical student wellness is headed? What are the new frontiers?
I guess I'll take the first stab at this, and I appreciate, are those birds chirping in the background, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm sitting outside of my porch, so I apologize if the birds are chirping too loud.
Don't apologize for that. I think about this a lot. I'm not exactly sure what the next thing is, or there is no panacea because wellness and burnout are so complex, and because so much of the angst and the frustrations and all that come from the work environment, right? They come from the EHR, it comes from CMS, who require things of the EMR, of trying to get a patient admitted to the hospital, of the patient who can't afford their hypertension medication, right? There's all these other things. I'm not sure. My opinion is that we need more data in order to get things like funding from the NIH, because right, we all know what all of us feel, but in my opinion, but it needs to be quantified, right? There needs to be numbers there so that we can show the need, develop interventions which cost money, and publish, when those things are successful. Unfortunately, there is no, short of foundations like the Gold Foundation, Schwartz Rounds, et cetera, there is not a lot of funding for wellness related things. The National Academy of Medicine has spent a lot of time and money addressing this, but they don't have funding, right? They don't fund studies themselves. So I believe, I'm a bit of a data person. I think we need more data and develop interventions and measure those interventions, but there's going to be a panoply of things needed.
Thanks for the great insight. Kind of along those same lines, it sounds like wellness interventions are just difficult to measure quantitatively. I guess, Dr. Alvarez, how do you measure the success of a wellness initiative? I've kind of heard the MASLAC Burnout Inventory mentioned a few times tonight, but what measurable should we use? How should we be collecting this data that Dr. Bird is mentioning to publish?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the things that I want to highlight is the survey that's the SAM wellness team actually led. So the professional fulfillment index was helpful. I think there's many other surveys out there, but I think also understanding the end users. So when we're talking about projects, I think you got to pilot a ton of these programs, right? Especially those that are resident driven. And then you have to study it, not just for successes, but also understanding when they don't take off. Because many of these interventions, in my experience, will not really stick, right? So I think understanding that these can be false fails, and really understanding that there's opportunities here to understand why it didn't work in the first place. I think for me, this is how innovation works. You have to be willing to try something out, because sometimes they don't continue because of maybe funding issues, right? So the trial that we did for reflection rounds, like one of the key limiting step there is hiring a chaplain for the longer term. And so we're trying to figure that out right now. Like, how can we align our efforts to maybe connecting with the School of Medicine, and then like making that more sustainable. And then of course there's the pandemic, which really prevents people from meeting in some of the interventions that you're trying to do. And so another point that I want to make here is that it's very important for residents to learn to do their QI elective. Because you don't just wake up one day and say like, I want to fix wellness. And so this is really how programs focus on just developing wellness lectures, which are not effective, as we know. And so really understanding like what makes it work, designing a system that's a lot more compassionate, I think can be a project. And in terms of measuring that, so I'll give you an example, Jeff, and you know this one. So a couple of years ago, our residents asked to change staffing in our emergency department. So from 12-hour shifts to 8-hour shifts. And so for the residency leaders in the audience, this is a perennial question, right? So which is better, long shifts and more days off, or shorter shifts and more time at home every day, right? So everybody's smiling that I can see in the picture here. Now, because this comes up every other year. So at Sanford, we've actually swapped back and forth every few years. So we looked at a particular request closer. We found that it was actually, the residents were saying that they're spending more time charting because of the newer demands of EHR. So the solution, therefore, is not just to switch back to 8-hour shifts, which we did. We gave the residents that extra hour in order for them to chart. And so they're already there, right? So why not just give them the credit for that? That is part of wellness interventions that we don't actually talk about. Oftentimes we talk about like many of the things that we talk about here tonight. But for me, I think part of the key intervention for wellness is efficiency in practice. And so the solution, again, like is to not just move it to 8-hour shifts, but adding that extra hour. So we also develop like different interventions to optimize the EHR, to minimize this idea of pajama time, or that the time that you spend outside of your clinical shift. This is what Dr. Bird was referring to earlier. And so those are things that you can measure. So the School of Medicine is actually tracking the pajama time for everybody in the hospital, and then sending these data to the chair. And so the chairs then will have to address this. If your department, if you realize that like the majority of your people are spending a ton of hours charting, then there's something that you can intervene there, right? So that's, I think, one thing that you can measure. So my point here, look at a problem from several diverse perspectives, ride the waves of resident enthusiasm, because I think that if they have an idea and you teach them the 5 whys of process improvement, in my experience, they're the most driven, most innovative talents that we have. And they do this day in and out, so they can even like pilot things with you. Again, I can go on and on about this. Like this is clearly like one of the best parts of my job. And as our chair, Dr. Rhonda Blomkans puts it, like wellness is being able to get to do your job and love it. And the path is not easy, but we can focus our efforts on like figuring out what can we do to make those paths like easier. And so the system solution, I think those are things that you can track. And in addition to your question, doing those surveys at the end of the year, right? So finding out about like people's like burnout levels, and also like how sticky is the project. Again, like if people really love it, then maybe there's something to that, and then find out more like whether did it work because it was really a great intervention, or did it work because the leader of that project was really so enthusiastic that they're able to convince like a lot of the stakeholders. Like I think for me, those are the really interesting questions to ask. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to a question. I love it.
No. it sounds like collecting data and measurables is extremely important for enacting meaningful change in regards to wellness. Along the lines of implementation, one of our goals for tonight is for our resident and medical student and our audience members to be able to take some of these initiatives and techniques back to their home institutions. Dr. Chung, as someone who started a very successful wellness intervention, what's your advice for residents and medical students attempting to implement some of these initiatives, and how do you gain support and funding? I think you kind of mentioned some of this at the end of your talk.
I mean, some of this is, I think you start with the people, right? You start with, who, I mean, assume if you're here, right, you are inherently like interested in this type of thing, and you're interested in, people's well-being and moving the needle and being an agent of change. And I think step one is really figuring out like who are your collaborators, who's on your team, who are your cheerleaders. And then once you get, what we call like a powerful coalition, going from there and really figuring out like what is our goal, what is our outcome. And I would argue people who are just starting out it is much more gratifying to have something tangible that you have been able to successfully implement and you see the result, and it's like so encouraging, and to be as specific as possible. And this is sort of our educator bent coming out, but you've heard this over and over, like, be specific, set a goal, set SMART goals, like, and all of that, kind of applies with these wellness interventions. But I think maybe just don't be discouraged. We talk a lot about, this, like, the National Academy of Medicine and like this national, this huge problem. And sometimes it could be like, oh, but my like little thing is just going to be this tiny drop in the bucket. And you know what? Every tiny drop counts. And whatever it is that, you are passionate about and you believe it will make a difference, I think. And again, like Ellie was saying, like, this is Dr. Alvarez was saying, like, it's how innovation works, right? And it's okay. It's okay. Everything, not everything needs to be some major like earth-shattering intervention. And I think whatever you can do to help and whatever really you're passionate about, I think that's important. And I think the more people that are aware and that try things, and even if those things don't work out, the more and more people that are invested in this, like, this is how eventually you make change, right? This is part of how you make change. I do think, just sort of reiterating the comments from the other panelists, that I think we all do have a responsibility, though, no matter what your intervention is, to demonstrate some outcome in some way, right? I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to other people to really document that for the future. I will say that one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, and I'm going to bring it up, is that I really think that qualitative research is underutilized when it comes to wellness interventions. And I think particularly, qualitative methods are great when you are trying to capture something for which there is no survey tool that really meets your goals and objectives. And I think oftentimes that is the case for many of these wellness interventions. For whatever it's worth, a lot of the interventions tend to be smaller, convenient samples of residents or medical school classes. And I think those are perfect, right? Those are perfect for qualitative methods. And then oftentimes they will often like uncover themes that maybe you weren't even anticipating to begin with. And so that would be my one area of encouragement, as well as if you're doing this intervention, you're like, I was like, I don't think the MBI is really not gonna, that there's a cost associated with, and you're looking around for a survey that's going to meet your needs. If you don't find one, that's okay. It doesn't mean that your intervention isn't worth pursuing. It just means maybe think outside the box a little bit as far as how you're going to measure it. And I really would encourage more things like focus groups, the thematic analysis, break out your anthropology hat, all those humanities majors, like, this is your time to shine, and really think about different ways of approaching this question of data gathering.
And I think utilizing communities of practice, because that's how now what I would do is talk to people like here, for instance, right? And then we share different projects, and then you kind of learn some new interventions, and then try that at your shop. Oftentimes what you have to do is like you have to iterate it a little bit to make it more amenable to your own your own shop. And I think that's very important because then you get to also make sure that maybe it's going to be a lot more successful in your program, or what we've learned in our program, just call it a bunch of pilots, right? So you can always change it afterwards if it doesn't work.
So it sounds like we should just get out there and try things. I'm going to ask a question.
I don't know about that. You got to like think about it a little bit more, I think. So that's why I mentioned the 5 whys. I think it's important to think it through, right? Because it's one thing to be so excited about a project. That was definitely me at the very beginning when I didn't really understand a whole lot about this. Like I would think of something and I would just do it. And then I realized like, there's other people that you're essentially like testing here. And so you have to be kind to them as well and make sure that there's enough thought process, and you got to involve them in stakeholders whenever you're making the intervention.
Got it. I'm going to ask a question from the audience from Dr. Goldner. What overall theory of well-being are people using when developing these interventions, if any?
I'll take a stab at that. That's a very sophisticated question. And I liken or think of the National Academy of Medicine's initial conceptual model of burnout, right? They had 7 different domains, 2 of which are personal, 5 of which are system issues. And I think that it's pretty clear that you need to address something everywhere. I don't know if that's I think that's just my opinion, that you need to address something everywhere. But if you can't really address or improve wellness if you only focus on one of those areas or 2 of those areas. So, as an example is, EHRs, perhaps rightfully so, get a lot of wrath, right, from physicians. If you go to Epic and Cerner, they'll tell you, we built our systems only to get the documentation required by CMS and by third-party payers, right? So Epic's like, whoa, we're just doing what you have to do to get paid, right? So then you have to go next step, right, and talk with CMS and third-party payers. Like, why do I have to have this, 10 plus review of systems, et cetera? Why is there so much document? Why are our notes 4 times longer than Scandinavia's and our health is 4 times worse, kind of thing? So I think you need to, so I think of wellness in that conceptual model and trying to do things in all of those buckets personally.
I can try this as well. I'm not sure if this would answer your question, Dr. Goldner, but for me, I think of the Stanford Professional Fulfillment Index. And so there's 3 big buckets in there, which is efficiency of practice, culture of wellness, and personal resilience. I think the majority of our work is really focused on the 2 parts, so the efficiency of practice and the culture of wellness. I think that it's often that when we talk about personal resilience, people are repulsed or even like offended that you're even insinuating that physicians are not resilient. And there's a paper that just came out, I think, last year that showed that physicians are indeed resilient people. It's the how we do things that really affects our well-being. And again, I think for me, just focusing on those and even what I'm learning lately is even like signposting that's all of the interventions that we're doing to create like a place where camaraderie is emphasized, professionalism, civility, like these things, right? Like sometimes we associate wellness, or often we associate wellness into just like more days off and maybe like retreats. And while they're helpful, they're very temporary. I think the longer term solution should be making sure that our work and our day-to-day practice is helpful, and at the same time that we get to take care of ourselves. I think for me, a lot of the interventions that I try to participate in are those types of projects. And I think aligning with the chief residents, like aligning with the residents, are very key in making that successful. Yeah, exactly. I like that quote. We all went bowling and we're still burnt out.
I think we have time for one last question. What resources currently exist to help promote and improve medical student and resident wellness?
I mean, I think there's lots of stuff that exists out there. I mean, I think social media has been a wonderful, wonderful way to share a bunch of ideas that people are doing across the board. I know RAMS, you know, one of the great things about having, you know, an organization like this is that you can get perspectives from all different residency programs across the country. And actually, really, people are generally very, very accessible with this. In this day and age, and I think, you know, that can be very helpful. Certainly, there's a bunch of stuff that's available on the National Academy of Medicine site, Action Collaborative for Clinician Wellbeing. The ACGME has a number of resources. The AAMC has resources as well. And so you can, these days, actually just poking around online, I find that, you know, if you go to those big powerhouses, oftentimes they're great, you know, areas and repositories to start with. But even just look, you know, going within your local contacts within RAMS can also be a really valuable source as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's several of these, like, again, communities of practice like RAMS and the Wellness Committee at SAEM, and really being involved in that and sharing the knowledge and the work that we're doing, because I think that's how we learn. I shameless plug for me, Dr. Stamen and myself are co-chairs of the Cord Wellness mini fellowship that's Dr. Gillespie is actually graduating from very lately. So I think those are a few opportunities to learn more about the program. Dr. Goldner is one of the mentors there as well.
All right. Well, I think that's the last question we have time for tonight. Thank you again so much to our panelists for their insights into improving the well-being of residents and medical students. Also, a huge thank you to the SAEM staff here who have helped to make this webinar possible. To the audience, thank you for joining us tonight. We hope to see you on another upcoming RAMS webinar. Stay safe and good night.
Thank you.